Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Steve Seepersod, coming to you from the campus of Binghamton University on behalf of the Alumni Association. Very excited to welcome you to today's program, which is titled Predictors of Marital Success. This is an event that's part of the Binghamton Learning Network webinar series, which itself is part of a wide slate of alumni programs that the Alumni Association is very pleased to offer you. We have all sorts of things ranging from career development programs to volunteer opportunities here at the university, lifelong learning initiatives, events in person and virtual, ways to connect you with the university and with other alumni. I have the Alumni Association website address at the bottom of the screen and invite you to take a look. You can look during the program, have it up on another tab, or take a look immediately following today's program. We definitely like to have alumni engaged with us. And the wonderful thing about it is this is something that you can do from anywhere in the world. While we have alumni who are heavily based in New York State, primarily in Binghamton and New York City area, we know our alumni are everywhere and we hear from alumni everywhere. So you can get involved from wherever you are. Very pleased to have you with us today. So we are going to be taking your questions during the next hour, and I'll introduce our speaker in just a few minutes. But just to do a little bit of housekeeping, we have three ways for you to send questions in. You can email them to me, and I'll put my address up at various times during the presentation where it doesn't step on the visuals that you're going to be looking at. sseepers@binghamton.edu. Email me your questions. In fact, we received one a couple of hours ago that we'll get into the mix as soon as we can. If you're watching us on Facebook, just type your question in as a comment and we will see it there. If you're watching on the microsite, just type your question into the comment box there and we will see your question. And immediately following Matthew Johnson's presentation, we will be happy to get to your questions. And it's not a hard stop from our side at 1 o'clock Eastern. We can go a little bit over as long as the questions and some good questions are coming in. So more on that to come. Before I introduce our featured speaker, I would like to bring in someone who has a very special message to share. His name is Owen Pell. He's a member of the class of 1980 and is chair of the board of directors for the Binghamton University Foundation. And he has some words to share about the work of the foundation and how it supports the university, and also about a very exciting initiative that we launched here at the university just about 3 weeks ago.
Hello, I'm Owen Pell, chair of the Binghamton University Foundation. The foundation is Binghamton's fundraising arm. We help the university's development office raise money and watch over the university's endowment and investments. We also work closely with President Stenger to support the mission of the university. Even though we are a modest endowment of just under $200 million, every year we give millions of dollars to the university, including for things where state money has been cut or simply is not available. For example, each year we give the university several million dollars for additional scholarships so that Binghamton can compete with other elite private and public universities for the very best students. The foundation also has given millions of dollars to support the university acquiring land in Johnson City for the new nursing school complex and the School of Pharmacy. In addition to alumni, almost 1/3 of our foundation board are from the Binghamton community, people who love the university and what it brings to the Southern Tier. The foundation provides all of us with a way of engaging with the university and making a difference. For me, that has been about two big projects. About 15 years ago, I endowed an honors thesis program and a thesis prize for undergraduates in philosophy, politics, and law. More recently, along with an anonymous donor, we established an institute for genocide and mass atrocity prevention, which makes Binghamton one of the few universities to offer a minor and a master's degree in this emerging and vitally important interdisciplinary academic area. Like many Binghamton graduates, many current Binghamton students, and many members of the foundation board, I was the first person in my family to graduate college. I have always viewed Binghamton as the place that launched me in life and as a gift that keeps on giving. On April 9th, Binghamton launched the Accelerate campaign, announcing a $220 million fundraising effort that will address key university priorities, investing in the people, faculty, and students who are our competitive edge. Please check it out at the address on your screen at accelerate.binghamton.edu. You can accelerate Binghamton and help shape the University of tomorrow by making a gift today. We hope that you both enjoy this webinar and use these webinars to reconnect with Binghamton. Thank you very much for attending, and I hope you will continue finding ways to support Binghamton University. Go Bearcats!
Oh, and thank you very much for that message. And we've talked about how to send the questions in and gone through the necessary housekeeping. So at this time, without further delay, let's bring in our featured speaker, Matthew Johnson, professor of psychology here at Binghamton University, and perhaps someone you had as a professor during your time here on campus. And we've had him for a couple of talks here at the Alumni Association, and other groups on campus have him as well. And these are always very popular, always very well received. We had over 100 people who had registered for this afternoon's webinar, and I was still getting emails right up until about 11:58 this morning asking, how can I see the webinar? It's too late to register. Can I get in? And you absolutely can get in. And so, Matt, thank you very much for joining us. Such a pleasure to have you. And at this point, we'll turn things over to you for what I know will be a very engaging presentation.
Great. Thank you so much, Steve. And thank you to the Alumni Association for inviting me. I really appreciate it. Engaging with alumni is one of the most rewarding aspects of being a professor. And so I really, really do appreciate this invitation. So let me get right into my talk so we can save time for questions. So I begin with a poem titled Advice by Langston Hughes. Folks, I'm telling you, birthing is hard and dying is mean. So get yourself a little loving in between. Hughes' poem captures the central roles of intimate relationships and the central role they play in our lives. So to illustrate this, let me ask you a question. Overall, how satisfied are you with your life? And take a moment to think about that. Because how you answer that question is more likely to be predicted by your satisfaction with your current intimate relationship than your satisfaction with any other part of your life. So let me repeat that. Our overall happiness in life is most closely aligned with our happiness or lack thereof with our intimate relationships. So also just let me pause for just a moment and clarify what I mean by intimate relationships. When I use that term, I mean close relationships that have, at least at a minimum, the potential for sex. So I'm talking about relationships with one's spouse or girlfriend or boyfriend. And I'm not talking about parents, children, friends, coworkers. That being said, some principles that I'll talk about with intimate relationships can be applied to other relationships in your life as well. So now that I've done that housekeeping and defined what I'm talking about with intimate relationships, let me go back to the fact that not only are intimate relationships and not only is intimate relationship satisfaction associated with overall life satisfaction, it's associated with nearly everything else that we care about. Intimate relationship quality is associated with our physical health. The association between intimate relationship quality and physical health is consistent, whether it's measured molecularly or in terms of morbidity. Put simply, the quality of our intimate relationships is a matter of life and death. For example, if you have heart disease, you are more likely to live longer if you're in a good relationship than if you're in a bad one. And not only is this association between physical health and relationship quality strong, it's consistent across races and ethnicities, as my student Jared McShaw and I wrote in 2015. It's also associated with mental health. As with physical health, the correlation with mental health is very strong. In fact, it's so strong that our relationship quality is associated with all but one of the 11 most common forms of mental illness. And again, Jared and I demonstrated that this is consistent across racial and ethnic groups. It's also associated with job performance. Relationship distress is associated with multiple job performance measures such as tardiness and absenteeism. And this means that there are significant and meaningful monetary correlates of relationship dysfunction at both the individual level and at the level of a society. And finally, and perhaps obviously, our relationship quality is associated with divorce, or its opposite, relationship stability. And so this is important because divorce is really impactful on us as individuals. To demonstrate that, let me show you this graph. And let me just walk you through it. On the y-axis is life satisfaction. And it's 0 is the mean of life satisfaction across participants, whether they were single, married, or divorced. On the x-axis is time in years, and the time of the divorce is the 0 mark. And so what you can see here is that relationship satisfaction on average declines as, life satisfaction declines consistently over time with relationship satisfaction declining. And then there's a divorce. And it goes back up a bit after the divorce. But the part that I want you to notice is that it then levels off. And it levels off below where it used to be. And this is important because it's really unusual. Most events in our life may impact our overall life satisfaction, but then we come back to baseline. So you might have something bad happen to you. It knocks down your life satisfaction for a while, but eventually you'll probably come up to where you were. Similarly, if something really good happens to you. Divorce is one of the few things that knocks down the life satisfaction, and it tends to stay down. So it's important. So I've asked Steve if we could do a pop quiz, and so we're going to give this a shot. And so given the centrality of intimate relationships in our lives, what do you think is most predictive of relationship outcomes? And here I'll make it a multiple choice test to remind you of college. Communication, partner support, contextual stress, aggression, or personal history. And so Steve, are we able to, I'm not sure how this is working. Can we put that poll up there?
So just to jump in and quickly just go over the format. If you're watching on the microsite, so if you scroll down from the viewer, you'll see there's 2 tabs, one for comments, one for poll. And so click on poll, and the poll question is there. If you're not seeing it, just go ahead and refresh, and it'll be there. But we should be up with the poll.
Okay, great. And would you be willing to just shout out what's coming in at number 1 for us, Steve? Even though I have a strong suspicion I know what it'll be.
Sure, I'll take a look on the back end to see what's getting the bulk of answers, and we'll jump in with the answer.
Okay. So I'll just as I'm hoping that you have already answered. I'll just say what a lot of people suggest is number 1 is communication. And as you may be thinking, that's probably not the answer. Otherwise, I wouldn't have made it a pop quiz, and you would be correct.
Overwhelmingly, so far, communication is the answer. So by about a 10-to-1 margin.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for confirming my belief. But it's actually aggression. Aggression beats them all by quite a bit. So that is the biggest predictor of relationship outcomes, is whether or not you're aggressive. I'm going to come back to that point a little later in the talk, so just tuck that away for a moment. So if you said communication, if you were one of the overwhelming majority saying communication, then you are a fan of social learning theory, and so am I. that's actually what attracted me to Binghamton University when I first went on the job market over 20 years ago, is because the psychology department here had a clinical psychology faculty who made empiricism and social learning theory, or sometimes we call this behaviorism, a real core aspect of the curriculum. The social learning theory, in its essence, applies the basic principles of learning, reward and punishment, to our interactions with others. So just like you are trying to train a dog to pee outside instead of on your rug, you might swat it on the nose when it pees inside, and you might give it a reward when it pees outside. That's social learning theory, but we do that, and we are both dog and dog owner in our relationships with others, and that's social learning theory in a nutshell. And colleagues of mine at Binghamton University, like Professors Jen Gillis and Ray Romanchik, have embedded these kind of behavioral approaches to their work and their science. In Jen and Ray's case, they use these principles to work with children with autism spectrum disorders and their families, and they help them understand behavioral principles and apply them. And so much of my career has actually been based on using this theory in my work on marriage. And so how does this work in marriage? Basically, this kind of shows you that when we apply social learning theory to intimate relationships, it rests on the premise that positive or adaptive interpersonal behaviors, when they're reinforced, or when negative or dysfunctional behaviors are ignored or punished, relationship quality improves. So, in other words, couples learn from each interaction about the quality of their relationship. And then as they feel better about the quality of their relationship, that these experiences accumulate and builds up satisfaction with the relationship or tears it down. And that then changes how couples behave with each other, and the cycle continues. That's the essence of social learning theory in intimate relationships. And it's been foundational for the science of intimate relationships. So it's a compelling theory. It offers a plausible causal mechanism that's presumed to drive judgments of intimate relationship satisfaction and stability. It outlines observable and potentially modifiable processes that we can address. It's parsimonious. It just simply makes sense. It's clear. It makes good sense. And importantly, for those of us who do science, it's testable. And much of the appeal of this theory is due to its near singular focus on dyadic behavior, that is, the behavior between two people in a relationship, which is a rich domain of psychological and interpersonal phenomenon. So the other thing about this theory is that couples really like it. Most of the couples who come to therapy present their problems in an interpersonal term, in some interpersonal way. So they talk about communication, they talk about each other's. And, I'll just share, to give you one example of a couple who come in, a couple comes into my office. I always just simply ask, essentially, why are you here? And, I remember a husband saying, well, we're here, we have a communication problem. My wife and I don't communicate very well. And I turned to the wife and she said, yeah, we don't communicate very well because he had an affair. So is the problem communication? Well, let's talk a little bit more about it. The other thing I'll just note is that social learning theory and behavioral interventions, this is in the mainstream. This article, What Shamu Taught Me About a Happy Marriage, this is the most emailed New York Times article ever. And it's an article about a wife who goes to SeaWorld and learns how they train animals and applies the same principles to her husband. So again, people like this theory. And so what's the problem? Okay, well, here's the problem. After applying social learning theory to studying the etiology, the origin of problems, to how to prevent problems, and how to treat problems in marriage for the past 30 years, I don't think it's exactly the right approach. And I'm going to try to make my case and present an alternative approach. I'm going to try to convince you of this using mainly my own findings, but there are others out there. So the first problem is that communication as a predictor of distress and dissolution is pretty weak and inconsistent. So you might, again, you'll recall that this emphasizes how couples communicate with each other. Way back in the early aughts, I tried Gottman. You may have heard of John Gottman. He's a big proponent of this. And he made a point that anger is fine in relationships, but contempt is so bad that he calls it one of the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. But in study after study, I've not been able to replicate his findings, and nor have others. Also, the content, so another study that I did with some colleagues was we looked at separating communication in a relationship, communication between partners in a relationship. And in this case, they were newlyweds. And we found that if you distinguish between the content of their communication, it's like what are they saying and how are they saying it? So you've heard this before. It's not so much what you're saying, but it's how you're saying it. So we said, well, okay, do those things predict differently when newlyweds are having these kind of interactions? Does it predict differently who will be happy and who will get divorced? And what I found was that only if you had bad content and bad affect being the outward expression of emotion, only then did we find that predicted a change in communication. A change in relationship satisfaction over time. And so that was unexpected. We really thought it would be more of a, both are bad and the combo would be bad, which it was, but we didn't expect that it would have to be that combo. So we also found that conflict frequency during the first pregnancy was only weakly predictive of relationship quality. And premarital communication, the premarital communication predictive effects are very complicated. We have bent over backwards to tease out, well, if it's not always predictive, when is it and when isn't it, and in what form? And my colleague Rich Mattson and I looked at, and our student Laura Frame looked at. One of the things we looked at was like, well, maybe it's just predicting different aspects of relationship satisfaction. And I can go into the details there, but the point is that it was quite complicated to really look at the ways in which it was predictive. And you'll recall that the entire appeal of the theory is that it's simple. Communication, when it's bad, should predict problems in the relationship. And so this set of findings is problematic for social learning theory. The other thing is we've based treatments on social learning theory. So if communication or other interpersonal problems are the problem, we should be able to modify those and improve relationships. And so the problem is that those treatments that are based on that are no better than other treatments. The good news is that if you are in a relationship and you're struggling and you have problems in your relationship, we're pretty good at treating that. If you go to couples counseling, go to couples therapy with a qualified therapist, we've got a pretty good shot at getting you, a little under, about 50% shot of getting you to the point that you're indistinguishable from people who are unhappy in their relationships. But there's no difference in what type of therapy you get, and that's a problem for this theory as well. So in other words, no incremental advantage for treatments focusing on communication. So the other thing is there's been a big market for trying to prevent relationship distress. And this is something that I really cut my teeth on when I was an undergrad, worked on it as an undergrad, as a graduate student, and as a faculty member here. And there's a well-known program out there. You're probably familiar with these. If you got married and you had to go talk with the priest or the rabbi or the imam or whoever was going to marry you before you got married, you've done some version of this probably. And the most well-known program like this is called PrEP. And the initial results about whether it's effective were quite promising. They did quasi-experiments, which means couples selected whether they were in the treatment group or the control group. So those not ideal, but those were promising. But then when they did studies randomly assigning people to treatment versus control group, the results really went away. And then so we did a study that you see cited down below, in which we also thought we could improve on PrEP by focusing, instead of on communication, more on empathy. And so we randomly assigned couples to either the PrEP group, the communication group, the empathy training group, or a group that watched romantic comedies and just talked about those for a while, so they didn't get any skills training. And all the groups had the same relationship satisfaction years later, the same divorce rate years later. But actually the romantic comedy group actually did better in some ways than either of our groups. And I say this as someone who worked on the development of PrEP back when I was an undergrad. I was the one who, my team, we developed the empathy intervention, and they just didn't work very well. So I come to this trying to tear down my own work, as you know, that's what scientists do. So this also has massive public policy implications, because starting in the 90s, going through the 2000s, across multiple presidential administrations, starting with Clinton and George W. Bush, continuing in the Obama administration, and continuing in the Trump administration, we've been pulling out between $75 and $100 million a year out of the federal welfare budget to have these kind of programs applied to poor couples in this country as a way to prevent poverty. I could talk a lot about that, and as you can see from the bottom here, I've actually written quite a bit about that, and we can certainly talk more about that. But there are big public policy implications with this. So but let me get back to the social learning model then. So I'm not alone in losing faith in our focus on social learning theory, and a lot of practitioners as well as researchers who focus on interactions within couples without examining others have found that they're struggling as well. And so let me give you a quote that really captures this from a researcher in New York who I like. Rick Heyman writes, a conceptualization of the husband is unhappy because he doesn't communicate well is about as useful a conceptualization as the patient died because his heart stopped beating. And I think there's a lot of truth to that. Obviously, communication is still going to be something we have to talk about, just as, our cardiac health is something we have to talk about for our well-being. But there's other things going on. And I think one way to, if you're an alum of one of the humanities programs. Maybe this is a reference that I would recommend for you. There's a short story by Richard Bausch called Letter to the Lady of the House that I think does a really nice job of capturing the ways in which communication can and cannot be predictive and indicative of relationship problems. Again, I guess I want to come back to, this is really my life's work here. And so that I've hit pause and I've kind of thought about what do we do next. And so as I'm going to suggest 3 things that we should start emphasizing as we study romantic relationships and other intimate relationships. The first is interpersonal behaviors that are strongly associated with dysfunction. So we know that there are behaviors that are more predictive of relationship dissolution than communication. So if you think of communication as a behavior, but we do know that other behaviors are much more predictive of discord and divorce in intimate relationships. So to give you a couple, infidelity would be one. And as I mentioned before, aggression is another one. And so why not pick some of this low-hanging fruit instead of keep wailing away at communication? So let me talk about that one a little bit more. So I mentioned that aggression and intimate partner violence are quite predictive of problems in the relationship. And this is something that we can study a lot more. And so I do will always emphasize that it's the #1 predictor of relationship dissolution, actually. And I've often wondered if we shouldn't like put this on the side of a bus or something. Like if you are violent because you don't want your partner to leave you, you're doing exactly the wrong thing. That assumes some rationality there that probably isn't there, but I think it's an important statement and an important point. Yet, despite that, assessment instruments and interviews that are available to measure this and to attend to it for those of us who encounter it as practitioners or scientists is really inadequate. The good news is that my doctoral student, Erin Alexander, is working on this right now. She has published a list of, done a review, a big review that was well received and is out in publication now on looking at the measures that are valid for understanding intimate partner violence and how we can address it. And she's also looking at a way of distinguishing between 2 types of intimate partner violence. And let me tell you about those 2 types. And I just want to hit pause for a moment and just note that in every talk I give to the public about marriage, I always include a slide about violence, because unfortunately, intimate partner violence is, if you study marriage, you study intimate partner violence, and it's quite prevalent. One of the most dangerous things a woman can do is actually enter into a relationship with a man. So we have to talk about it. And so let me tell you about what the field thinks and what my student Erin Alexander is examining, whether it's true or not. But we, as a field, we at the moment think there are really 2 types of intimate partner violence. The first would be situational couple violence. These are where heated arguments escalate to the point that the couple, the people in the couple might start assaulting each other. These tend to be reactive. And interestingly, they tend to be, the violence is initiated equally often by men and women. And we have some interventions that we think work here. And so I think there's some hope that we could really address these if it's a low level of violence. The other type is sometimes called intimate terrorism. Sometimes it's called patriarchal terrorism. The word terrorism is a little problematic here, but it's really kind of a controlling violence. And this is a violence that is about an effort to dominate or subjugate the other person. Control is the defining feature, as I just mentioned. And in this type of violence, it's almost always initiated by men. And the best treatment here, if you are in a relationship with this kind of violence, is to make yourself unavailable to the perpetrator of this violence. And it's for that reason that I always want to encourage you, wherever you are watching this, to support your local intimate partner violence agency or domestic violence agency. Here in Broome County, the designated agency is RISE. I've got their phone number and website at the bottom. A really great organization that I've been affiliated with on their board at times over the years. So, okay, let's bring it back for a moment. I've covered that one. So the second thing I think we can do is to link, is to emphasize the link between enduring vulnerabilities and interpersonal behavior. So this link, so what I mean by enduring vulnerabilities are the things that you bring to the relationship, that each partner brings to the relationship before they get there. So I'm talking about maybe a mental health problem or other kinds of vulnerabilities, maybe a communication problem that you bring to the relationship. And there are some links there. Let me talk about that a little bit more. We know through some of our work and the work of others. This is a picture of Zach Collins, who is a doctoral student of mine, who is now an Army psychologist at Fort Drum and embedded in their behavioral health team there. He found associations between neuroticism, sometimes we call that negative affectivity, attachment style, and parental marital quality are correlated with both communication and marital satisfaction. So he had a really nice dissertation where he looked at some of the links between these variables and how they then predicted changes in relationship satisfaction. So I think there's a lot more we could do there with that. And then the third point, and the one that I'm pretty excited about, is looking at the interaction between context and interpersonal behaviors. And so we can do a better job of thinking about, by context, I mean like the stressors that people are involved in, and how does that interact with their behaviors to then predict outcomes. So this is a model that is not particularly new. I cite myself here, but I've really borrowed this as a site. In fact, models like this have been around since the 1940s. But I put it up here because it's the model that my students and I use to really guide the work that we do in our research. And so you can see in this model, we start with contextual stress, the stress that's out there. I don't know, maybe if you're in, say, a pandemic or something like that. And this dyadic behavior, this is communication. This is what you all were thinking would be predictive. And so this is, how the couple interacts with each other. And so the point of this model is we know that stress leads to relationship quality and changes in it. And we know that there's a large literature on that. I could talk about that more. And that this emphasis on how the couple handles stress can then impact the way in which these two things are linked. So I could talk quite a bit about this model. I really like it. So it's, in other words, if you think about stress, one way we can think about this is, like, let's just say you have a stressor at work, a stressful day at work or something. How does your partner help you deal with your stressful day, and how that happens will then impact your relationship quality, which of course will lead to your relationship stability. So this is what I've been thinking a lot about lately. And so let me then go to our next pop quiz. And so here's your quiz. Imagine that your spouse or partner says, I want to lose weight, so I'm going to go on a diet. What do you say in response? I'll make it again a multiple choice question. So option one, hopefully you can see that. Option one is I agree, you should lose weight. How can I help? Option two, I'll go on the diet with you. Option three, without even taking your eyes off the television, you give a perfunctory response. So, okay. Option four, fine, but I'm not eating your diet food. I'm fine with being overweight myself. Or five, you don't need to go on a diet. You're perfect as you are. So I'll sit back and let Steve tell us what the answers are as they come in.
They're starting to trickle in, and they're settling largely in one place. So we'll give that a little bit more time, maybe about 20 seconds or so, and see what we get. Still some more coming in. That's good. So this is a great question, and it'll be interesting to see where people land on it and what the preferred answer should be.
I'm less certain what people will say on this one.
I know the answer I would not pick if I was really interested in having a harmonious relationship, and I'll just kind of leave it there. So I think you and I are kind of on the same page with that, and probably most others as well, but I don't want to color the results we're getting. So I've got it.
It's not an especially scientific poll, but I am curious what people will think.
All right, I think this may be a good place to call it. So most of the answers are coming in on I'll go on the diet with you. One that came on, not taking your eyes off the TV, you say okay. And there were three, I thought this would probably be zero on, I agree, you should lose weight. So that's where we.
All right, that is helpful. So it sounds like number one was I'll go on the diet with you. Fantastic. The right answer was number three. I think Steve said there were 2 or 3 answers that said number three. If that was you, congratulations. You have a spouse who probably feels supported. So let's dig into that. But I will say, in case you have a lot of questions about this particular item, this particular question of how do you support your spouse, or how do can your spouse support you if you're trying to get healthier? This book that I have up there, I know it's a little hard to see. There's a book called Love Me Slender, which is actually all about this very issue. It's a really good book, scientifically based about how to support your spouse in getting healthier. And the upshot is that that it's really complicated. And so social support, in other words, supporting your spouse is good sometimes. And so, so newlyweds who display more emotional support and practical support report higher levels of marital satisfaction. And, a really great example of this is from this of course is Christopher Reeves and his wife, Dana. And they wrote a beautiful book together before he passed called Still Me, Still Us, after his accident left him quadriplegic. And so they have a nice book on that. But it is complicated. And the right answer for the last question indicated, it really is quite complicated. And so, and sometimes invisible support is the best kind. And so going back to that previous question, what we found was that supporting your spouse So here's just a few research facts. Women lose more weight with uninvolved husbands than with husbands who are trying to help. Heart attack victims recover more slowly when they get more support from their spouse. And there are other findings like this. There's a real classic study of couples in which one was studying for a bar exam. I know a couple lawyers in town who said they'd be watching today, so they know what I'm talking about. And so it's really stressful studying for the bar exam. And so the researchers went in and checked in with the person studying for the exam and their partner for every evening for 32 days prior to the exam. And they asked essentially, are you receiving support from your partner, about, and they asked the partner, are you giving support to the one who's studying for the test? And on days that the test taker reported receiving support, anxiety and depression increased. And on days when the non-test taker reported giving more support than the test taker reported receiving, anxiety and depression decreased. So in other words, when a spouse was giving support to their partner and that partner didn't really even recognize it or couldn't articulate it or see it, that was the best and most beneficial type of support. So it really is quite complicated. The interaction between context and interpersonal behavior, we've studied a bit of it. Now that I've kind of given you that framework, let me tell you a little bit about the work we've done in the lab here. My student, Haley Fivecoat, she looked at the interaction between context and interpersonal support, and she found that that there was the use of invisible support was really beneficial to families that were called, that we think of and others think of as fragile families. These are families that are living at or near the poverty line and have kids and might be struggling with a lot of contextual stress, and that invisible support really helped them as well. And I'll just note that Haley is now on the faculty at Northwestern in their Family Institute there. Another study we did was we looked at intimate relationships as they moderate the association between perceived discrimination. And I say perceived here simply because we're asking people for their perception of whether or not they were discriminated against. And we know that perceived discrimination is negatively correlated with health. So in other words, the more you perceive that you're being discriminated against, the more you have health problems. My student, my doctoral student, Jared McShaw, who I mentioned earlier, he looked at how relationship quality can moderate that association. And Jared, who in this picture has just been hooded, is now in private practice down in the Westchester area. And then I had another student who looked at the role of familismo, so we know that there's an association between acculturation and stress, and that not being very acculturated to a community, as many new immigrants aren't very well acculturated, and that stress is associated with lower levels of relationship quality, and that it's a pretty big correlation. And what Karen was able to show was that this concept of familismo, which is distinct from social support, it's a little different. Other people could probably describe a little better the distinction there, but it's really familismo is kind of a concept that's very common in Latinx families, in which there's a real centering of the family in their day-to-day activities, and that the more people endorse that, the less that there was a negative association between the acculturative stress and relationship quality. And Karen is now a psychologist at a large hospital in Manhattan and adjunct professor at Queens College. So to summarize all this, I guess what I would say here is that we can't ignore communication. Of course, social learning theory is still there, it's still important, but I do think that we as scientists, clinicians, and couples are overemphasizing it, and that we really should reallocate our interpersonal resources, our research resources, to intervening more effectively with people who may be experiencing aggression or violence, to people who are bringing some enduring vulnerabilities, such as mental health problems, to relationships, and to contextual stress. That really is something we need to be paying a lot more attention to. And so I really end with, that I've been following these principles of behaviorism my whole career, and that I wasn't the first. Even in the 1950s, John Tiebout and Hal Kelly started out. There were two social psychologists said, we're going to understand how groups work. And so they said, well, first, we're going to spend the first year studying how couples work, because couples are the smallest group you can have. And then they spent the next 40 years of their career just studying couples. And the point here is there's a lot we don't know. And this brings me to what I want to end with, my favorite quote. It's actually the quote that's on the poster behind my head here. It's a quote by Ambrose Bierce, a great American short story writer, journalist, poet, Civil War veteran. And he, in his book, The Devil's Dictionary, he defines education as a noun, that which discloses to the wise and disguises from the foolish their lack of understanding. And I think that's really where I am in some ways now, as I enter the next stage of my career in trying to understand these problems. And if you want to know a little bit more about that, I'll do a little log rolling for myself here. This is a book that I wrote that covers a lot of what I've covered in this talk, and widely available. So thanks again. Before we do questions, just a few things. I want to really thank my current and former students. They're all fantastic, as you all know. They really are great here. I learn a ton from them. I want to thank my patients, my current and former colleagues here in psychology, and a big shout out to Steve and Jen and others in the alumni office who helped me out get this all set up. And then it seems like I should probably thank my wife, Deanne. That didn't go well. So I'm ready to take some questions, Steve, except for how you pronounce my wife's name.
Okay, well, thank you, Matt, for a fascinating presentation, and got some cool pictures up on the screen. It looks like some familiar faces. Is that Johnny Cash and June Carter at the bottom in the middle?
That is them. Yeah, that is. If you have not read their love story, it is really, really worth reading. I think they have the best love story of any living or fictional, living, dead, or fictional love story. I really think there's a great This American Life that covers their love story. So if you're just looking for a really good love story, read up on June and June Carter and Johnny Cash. It's a great love story.
And we have about 5 or 6 minutes up until 1 o'clock. So I will put the banner back with my email. So if you have any questions between now and 1 o'clock or a little bit after, feel free to send them in. I have email up on my computer as well. I'll definitely be checking. But it's just really fascinating to look at these relationship dynamics and how incredibly complicated they are. And you think about what's functional for one couple may not necessarily be that for another. And we think about communication and just digesting this presentation and getting a sense of how some of the things we've accepted as conventional wisdom are sort of upended by the things that are happening in the current research. And it's easy to oversimplify the importance of communication. You look at a couple that seems to fight all the time, and like, well, that's a good thing. They're communicating, right? Well, maybe not necessarily. Or we've stopped communicating. Well, we've stopped communicating because you did something I can't live with, like had an affair, or there may be some interpersonal violence or something like that. We've just stopped communicating. It's not the lack of communication is the problem. It's the thing that led to that. That's the issue. So really super interesting to think through all of that. I have a question that came in, and this was emailed to us prior to the show. So I was very excited to see the eagerness in receiving the content from today's webinar. Does active church attendance by married couples help to stabilize a marriage? And does being raised in a faith-based home help in forming a stable marriage?
Oh, that's a really, really great question. And people have been looking at that. And so there is some effect there. Some where it's the so there are the divorce rate's lower for people who are active in the church. So I can confirm that. The satisfaction rate is a bit higher. One of my favorite findings, honestly, with that is actually they tend to report more sexual satisfaction. So that's now there's some questions about the sampling there, but but generally speaking, there is there does. I'm not aware of any downsides to that. The effects are not huge. But there is, I think there is some benefit to, having that kind of structure in your life. And I'll just say, one more thing about that, I guess, if you think about the model that I was proposing there, if we think about contextual stress, one of the things that belonging to a faith-based organization does for you is it helps you, it gives you a community, and it gives you a chance to another route to helping with the contextual stress that you may experience. And so there's a support system there. And we know that when people have, safety nets and communities of support, that really decreases stress. And when there's decreased stress, you have more time and energy to really attend to your relationship. So I think, and that could, that kind of community of support can come from a wonderful group of friends that you may have. It can come from a faith-based organization or others like that. So I think there is a bit of benefit to that. And I think it's something that a lot of sociologists and anthropologists have kind of written about, the decline of some of the kind of community organizations that we had in generations past. So good question.
I was thinking back to the slide you had toward the probably in the second half of the presentation. It's basically a flow chart showing where the contextual stress comes in, and then relationship quality and outcome. And it seems to me that would you say that that's where second marriages, even third or fourth, really have potential for higher problems in a first marriage, where people are coming in, there are the issues that are resolved or unresolved at various levels, and just you have all sorts of things that add additional stress from the previous relationships. Maybe it's kids in custody or things you went through with the other person that you are still trying to sort out. And then, it's almost like having, it literally is like another person in the middle of the relationship, and makes the other parts in that flow chart much more difficult to navigate.
I think that could be. I mean, it is interesting. I mean, that, we do know that, so roughly 50% of first marriages end in divorce, and then it goes up from there. It's so it's also interesting that when people get divorced, they tend to get remarried. These are a little bit old data. I need to look at the new census data, but it is, people don't tend to give up on the institution of marriage. But I think the, kind of more parsimonious explanation there is simply that past behavior predicts future behavior. And so I think that's a lot of what's going on. But I do think, to your point, Steve, about the contextual stress, I think, what I like one of the things that diagram really shows is that when you have a stress, there's a old phrase that I've heard, in the forest, all the trees look the same. Only the storm can tell the weak from the strong. And so, when you have a marriage or another type of intimate relationship and a big stressor sweeps in, that can really tear apart some marriages that were struggling, and it can strengthen some relationships. There's a lot of data that supports this. There's a great study that I put in a lot of my talks. I didn't put it in this one. If you look at counties that were really impacted by a hurricane, and then ones that compare them to similar counties that weren't in the same state, and they compared the marriage rates before the hurricane and then after. And the marriage rates in the counties that were really hit hard by the hurricane went up after it. And so it really brought some relationships together. But in those same counties, the divorce rate also went up compared to the other counties. And the third one was that the rate of childbirth went up in the impacted counties, which might have had more to do with the power being out for a while and no TV to watch.
Yeah, interesting to see the three different trends that emerge as a result of the storm happening. So, kind of, yeah.
It could really strengthen some, and it could really harm others. But I will be watching the birth rate, when all of us were out of power. Let's look 9 months from now. If you're an obstetrician, don't take off 9 months from now.
And we just had a storm here in the Binghamton area, and so we talked about hurricanes. I thought it would be something about trees and an analogy to strong spots and weak spots, because for those not familiar with what had happened here, we had a snowstorm that by itself, the snow wasn't really anything huge compared to things we've seen much larger, but it was so heavy and wet that resulted in a tremendous amount of tree damage. And so I think I had this conversation with my son where I said, these weak spots in the trees were just there all this time, and it just took this crisis for part of our tree came down and others across. It felt like it was almost everybody. And so but yes, it'll be interesting to see if 9 months later, as well, this storm, there's anything that happens. People found things to do while the power are out.
And my joke works because a lot of people had power out here in town for days and days.
So we'll keep an eye on that for early in 2023. So I'll pass along one comment that we received in the chat, and then I think that may be a good place to wrap it up for today. And the comment is, I found the literature on support and health condition management / recovery interesting, as it seems to contrast literature on social support and PTSD.
Yeah, no, and that's the point, is there you can find contradictory findings out there for sure, and it really is complicated. And you're right. I mean, so you're making the commenter's making a really important distinction here. And so there are ways in which offering support, and the theory currently is there are ways in which offering support can suggest that you're doing worse than you actually think you're doing. Okay. So, I was teaching a lecture class once, and I had a student come up to me after the class and just said, "Professor Johnston, are you okay? You look terrible." And I was like, "I'm fine." I felt fine. I felt fine until the student asked me that question. I don't know, I was just looking really pale that day or what, but, so I didn't feel supported, and I felt frankly worse after that support. But the commenter is making a really important distinction, because we do know that when you are seeking support and when you are struggling with something, and whether that's PTSD or other mental illnesses, or financially or what have you, having an offer of support that in a domain that you want support and have expressed a need for it can be really beneficial. And that's why giving support is a really complicated thing. And you want to make sure that the recipient of the support you're offering is wanting that support, and needing that support, and that type of support. Maybe it's practical, maybe it's emotional. So it is, the provision of social support is touchy. I'll just throw out one more thing: is if you want to be safe, instead of looking for those moments to offer support, look for the moments to celebrate. So find a reason. If you want to support someone you love or someone you care for, when something good happens to them, celebrate that like crazy. Make a big deal of it. That, we know there are huge benefits, both for the couple and for the individual, to really, and for yourself. If something good happens to you, celebrate it. And there's a lot of good data that says that's really beneficial. So maybe that's the way to end, is let's all look for the things to celebrate in year 3 of this pandemic. Let's all look for things to celebrate and capitalize on when good things happen.
That second poll question was great about the support, and somebody wants to go on a diet, and you think about the two sides of the interaction, somebody that wants to give support, and hopefully there's somebody that wants to receive it. And so everybody gravitated, or most people, toward that. I'll go on the diet with you. It sounds supportive. It sounds great. I'll do it with you.
Mm-hmm.
You know, how could you turn that down? And maybe that's not necessarily the best answer, but for some it might be. It's sort of knowing that audience, and maybe that other person, that's the thing that really resonates with them. So it shows how complicated this all is. But yeah, hopefully there'll be some great outcomes. And yes, year 3 of this pandemic, we really need some things to celebrate, because it's been a rough couple of years, and everybody's been scarred in some way, big or small, as a result of what's happened. So here's looking toward a brighter future for everyone, and hope that it starts real soon if it hasn't already. So Matt, thanks so much for joining us today. It's a pleasure as always to have you on these talks with us here at the Alumni Association. We know they're very well received, and you had some friends from the forum and here in the community that joined in today, former students, and then lots of people in the alumni community that were very eager to hear what you had to say. So thanks very much, and appreciate the time that you spent with us in the last hour, and then also in the run up to today's event as well.
Thank you, Steve. It's been great, and really look forward to seeing everyone in person, hopefully at some other alumni event on campus soon. So, thanks again.
And just to pass along a reminder, on May 11th, we're going to be back with Tier Talks, talks that inspire, educate, and resonate. And the topic is going to be the future of K through 12 education. And so talking about the pandemic here, to wrap up this program about relationships, the pandemic is certainly very front and center in K through 12 education, has had a lot of effects on the kids. And where do we go from here? That's going to be the topic that we have 4 alumni who are working in the field of education will be with us to talk about where education goes from here. How do we address learning loss? How do spaces adapt to meet the needs of kids in the future? So check us out, binghamton.edu/alumni. I'll pull up the banner really quick. That's the place where you can find the link to register for the Tier Talks event Wednesday, May 11th, as well as information about the other programs I started to talk about at the outset of today's program. So for Matt Johnson and Jen Gabriel, I'm Steve Seepersod. Have a great rest of the day, and we'll see you next time on the Binghamton Learning Network.